The snow had been falling for 3 hours when they threw her off the wagon. She landed face first in a drift so deep it swallowed her to the waist, and by the time she clawed herself upright and spun around, the wagon was already disappearing into the white curtain of the storm, the crack of a whip swallowed whole by the howling Montana wind. She screamed after them. She screamed until her throat was raw and her voice broke apart like ice on a frozen river. But the prairie of 1878 was a merciless thing, and it did not care about the screams of a woman named Ruth Aldine Calloway, not yet 23 years old, left alone in the mouth of a blizzard without so much as a blanket to her name. Asterisk if you believe in kindness, in second chances, and in the God-given goodness of the human heart. Like this story, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. Someone out there needs to hear what happens next. Asterisk. Ruth had trusted them because she had no other choice. That was the cruelest part of it. She had buried her father 6 days earlier in a shallow grave outside of Billings, using a flat river stone as a headstone because she could not afford lumber. Jedediah Calloway had been a homesteader, a man of stubborn dignity and quiet faith, and when the fever took him in October, it took with it every plan Ruth had ever made for her life. The Hartwell family, neighbors of a sort, traveling south toward the Wyoming Territory, had offered her a seat on their wagon and passage to a settlement called Clearwater Crossing, where, they said, a widow woman ran a boarding house and needed a girl for domestic work. Ruth had packed her father's Bible, her mother's silver thimble, and the last $4 she had in the world, and she had climbed aboard believing that God had finally sent her a mercy. What she had not understood, not until it was too late, was that the Hartwells were not neighbors. They were opportunists. They had taken her $4 on the second morning, claiming it was payment for her seat on the wagon. They had eaten her portion of the dried venison and told her she was welcome to gratitude. And when the blizzard rolled down from the north and the trail became treacherous and the wagon heavy, they had decided that Ruth Aldine Calloway was the most expendable thing they were carrying. She stood now in the snow, the cold already working its way through her thin wool coat with the patience of something ancient and indifferent. The wind came at her in great sweeping walls that stole her breath and blurred her vision until the world was nothing but white and gray and the memory of warmth. She knew enough about cold to know what it did to a body when the body stopped fighting. She had seen it in livestock. She had seen it, once, in a man. She began to walk. She did not know which direction she walked. She walked because stopping was dying, and dying was something she refused to do on the same week she had buried her father. She walked with her arms wrapped around herself and her head bowed against the wind, and she prayed in the broken, half-formed way that people pray when prayer is the only currency they have left. She prayed to her mother, dead these 10 years. She prayed to her father. She prayed to the God her father had spent his whole life trusting, even when the harvests failed and the creek dried up, and the world gave him nothing back for his faithfulness. She had been walking perhaps 40 minutes, though it felt like a lifetime, and also like no time at all, when she heard the horse. She heard it before she saw it, the deep, rhythmic crunch of hooves through snow crust, and she turned toward the sound with the desperate, animal instinct of a creature that has nothing left to lose. The shape that emerged from the white was enormous and dark, a big black quarter horse moving at a careful, deliberate walk, and on its back sat a man so still and upright that for one wild moment Ruth thought she might be seeing something that was not entirely of this world. He wore a heavy canvas duster coated in snow, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, and he had a wool scarf wrapped around the lower half of his face against the wind. He pulled up short when he saw her, and for a long moment neither of them moved. Then he swung down from the saddle in one smooth motion, and he pulled the scarf from his face, and Ruth saw that he was perhaps 40 years old, with a jaw like a fence rail, and eyes the particular gray blue of a winter sky just before it breaks open. His name was Nathaniel Holt, though she would not learn that for another hour. What she learned in that moment, standing in the killing cold with snow in her hair and terror in her chest, was the look on his face when he saw her. Not suspicion, not calculation, not the particular wariness that men on the frontier often wore like armor. What was on his face was something far simpler and far rarer. It was concern. He crossed the distance between them in 4 long strides, stripped his duster from his own shoulders, and wrapped it around her without a word. and it was so warm from his body that Ruth very nearly wept from the shock of it. Then he looked her full in the face, and his voice was low and certain in the way that the voices of men who spend their lives outdoors often are, shaped by years of giving commands to horses and cattle in all kinds of weather, never raising it above what was necessary. "You'll come with me now," he said. It was not a question. It was the kind of statement that carries its own quiet authority, the authority of a man who has decided something and does not intend to be argued with. Ruth, who had not been truly warm in 6 days and who had been walking toward her own death in a blizzard, did not argue. He lifted her onto the horse as if she weighed nothing, mounted behind her, and turned the animal west. He did not ask her name yet. He did not ask what had happened. He simply rode, one arm steady around her to keep her in the saddle, and he talked to the horse in a low murmur to keep it calm in the storm, and Ruth Aldine Calloway held on to the saddle horn with both hands and felt, for the first time in a very long time, that she was not entirely alone in the universe. The ranch was called the Double H, and it sat in a wide valley ringed by pine-dark mountains that Ruth could barely see through the thinning storm as they came down into it. There was a main house of squared timber, a barn twice its size, several outbuildings, and the warm amber glow of lamplight in the windows that Ruth thought was the most beautiful sight she had seen in her life. Nathaniel Holt called out as they rode into the yard, and a boy of about 14 came running from the barn, his son, Marcus, dark-haired and serious-faced, and staring at Ruth with frank, unguarded curiosity. Inside the house, beside a cast-iron stove that radiated heat like a small sun, Ruth finally stopped shaking. An older woman named Constance, who turned out to be Nathaniel's aunt and the keeper of the household, pressed a tin cup of coffee into Ruth's hands and sat across from her and listened without interruption while Ruth told her story. All of it. The fever, the grave, the Hartwells, the wagon, the snow. When Ruth finished, Constance was quiet for a moment, and then she said, simply, "Well, you'll stay here then," as if the matter were already settled, which, Ruth would come to understand, it was. Nathaniel Holt was not a talkative man, but he was a consistent one. He was a cattle rancher who ran 700 head across the valley and the lower mountain pastures, and he ran his operation with the same quiet, deliberate authority with which he had pulled Ruth from the blizzard. He had been a widower for 4 years. His wife, Eleanor, had died of complications in childbirth, taking the infant with her, and he had raised Marcus alone since then, with Constance's help, and built the Double H into something that required every hour of every day he could give it. He did not have time for pretense or for small talk. He had time for work and for honesty and for the occasional, carefully chosen word that carried more weight than most men's speeches. Ruth earned her place from the first morning. She was up before Constance, had the stove going and the coffee on, and by the time Nathaniel came in from the early feeding, she had eggs and cornbread on the table and the kitchen in better order than he had seen it in months. He sat down, looked at the plate, looked at her, and said, "Can you ride?" She said she could, after a fashion. He nodded and said she would learn the rest. The weeks that followed were the hardest and the most alive Ruth had ever felt. She learned the rhythms of the ranch, the feeding and the mending, the way the snow had to be cleared from the cattle troughs twice a day in deep winter, the way Marcus needed someone to read with him in the evenings because Constance's eyes were failing and Nathaniel was too tired by dark to hold a book steady. She read to Marcus from her father's Bible and from the one-dime novel he owned, a battered copy of something about Texas Rangers that he had read so many times the cover had separated from the spine. She taught him the hymns her father had taught her. He taught her to rope a fence post, which she was terrible at for 3 weeks, and then suddenly not terrible at all. In the afternoon she finally caught the post clean on the first throw. Marcus let out a whoop that brought Nathaniel in from the far corral to see what had happened. She saw Nathaniel watching her sometimes, in the careful, sideways way of a man who is not certain what he is watching for. She did not push against it. She had learned, in the years of homesteading beside her father, that the frontier demanded patience above almost every other virtue, and that things worth having came slowly and only to those who stayed. Spring came to the valley like a long exhale, the snow retreating up the mountains inch by inch, the grass returning first gray-green and then bright, the cattle moving out across the pastures with the particular ease of creatures returning to their right element. Ruth planted a kitchen garden along the south wall of the house. Tomatoes and pole beans and onions, and a row of marigolds that Constance said were foolish but smiled at whenever she passed them. She wrote letters to no one, because there was no one to write to. But she filled the pages of her father's Bible with small notes in the margins, observations and prayers, and the occasional line of beauty she wanted to remember. She was beginning, slowly and with great care, to build something that resembled a life. It was in early May, on an evening so clear and warm that the whole valley smelled of pine and new grass, that Nathaniel found her sitting on the porch steps with the Bible in her lap, watching the last of the light leave the western sky. He sat down beside her, which he had never done before, and for a while neither of them said anything, because the silence between them had grown into the comfortable kind over the months, the kind that does not need to be filled. Then he said, in his low, careful way, that he had been thinking. She said she reckoned that happened to most people. He almost smiled. He said he had been thinking that the Double H was a hard place for a woman alone, but that it was perhaps not so hard for a woman who was not alone, if that woman were willing. He said it the way he said everything, plainly and without decoration, without romance in the words, but with something in the voice beneath them that was more than plain. Ruth looked at him for a long moment. She thought about her father's grave outside Billings, and the Hartwells, and the snow, and the particular quality of the cold in the moment before he had wrapped his coat around her. She thought about Marcus reading by lamplight and Constance's failing eyes and the marigolds along the south wall. She said yes. They were married by the circuit preacher 6 weeks later, on a Saturday in June, with Marcus standing up straight beside his father and Constance dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief she pretended was for the dust. Ruth wore a dress of blue calico that Constance had sewn from goods ordered out of Miles City, and she carried a sprig of the wild columbine that grew along the creek, and she held her father's Bible because she had nothing else of his to carry, and she wanted him there. The preacher read from Ruth, the book of Ruth, the first chapter, the part about where you go I will go, and where you lodge I will lodge, and Ruth Aldine Calloway, who was now Ruth Holt, stood in the valley that had been given back to her by a blizzard and a stranger and the stubborn grace of God, and she wept in the open, unashamed way of a woman who has survived enough to know that joy is not weakness. Asterisk before this story ends, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? And what is the one lesson this story left in your heart? Every comment is a reminder that stories still matter, and that kindness still moves through this world like a river, quiet and unstoppable. Asterisk. Years later, when Marcus was grown and had a spread of his own in the next valley, and when the Double H had expanded to 1,000 head and a reputation for the finest beef in the territory, people in Clearwater Crossing would sometimes ask Ruth Holt how she had come to be there, in that valley, in that life. She would tell them the truth, because she had learned from her father that the truth, even when it was hard, was the only thing worth giving people. She would tell them about the wagon and the snow and the cold that she had felt in her very bones, and about the shape of a man on a black horse emerging from the white, like something her prayers had conjured. She would tell them that the worst moment of her life had delivered her to the best one, and that she had learned, in the long Montana winters and the bright Montana summers that followed, that grace very rarely arrives the way you expect it to. It arrives cold and sudden and wrapped in a stranger's coat. It arrives at the bottom of the worst day you have ever lived. It arrives when you have nothing left and no reason left to keep walking, and then it puts you on a horse and rides you home. She kept the marigolds along the south wall every summer for the rest of her life. She said they were for foolishness. She said her father would have approved. Asterisk if this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that one act of kindness can change the entire direction of a life, please like, comment, share, and subscribe. Stories like Ruth's are why we tell these tales. Carry this one with you. Pass it on. Someone out there is walking through their own blizzard right now, and they need to know that the horse is coming. Asterisk.